Hello, welcome to week 2. We're going to be looking at the United States Constitution today, its structure and formation, specifically how we get to the U.S. Constitution. So I'm going to take you through some of the notes just to give you a little more detailed explanation. So the first thing that you need to understand is a Constitution is our basic law. It creates our political institutions. Like Congress, the presidency, the executive. It is also considered a higher law, which means that it is above any laws that we make. So any law that is made by Congress or a state has to be in line with what's inside the Constitution. Key thing to remember, though, is that the rules that the Constitution creates is not necessarily neutral. It can benefit some people over others. In fact, this is one of the sticking points when the Constitution was first adopted or sent out to be adopted that people complained about. They thought it was a egalitarian document, a document that benefited a wealthy aristocracy over the common person. So we go back in this, and this is the only history part of this course specifically, and because we have to understand a document that was created in 1787 that governs us in 2022. So that's kind of the nature of your discussion board this week as well, is should we make the amendment process easier, considering we're governing ourselves under a document written by a very different generation in a very different time. So we begin this in the 1700s. Specifically with the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War was a war fought between Britain and France all over the world. It's known as the 7 Years' War to the rest of the world, the French and Indian War to us. One of the effects of that war was we had to pay for it. Okay? And since the colonies were British owned, they weren't really taxed all that much before the war. We had kind of an understanding that we would provide raw materials, and Britain would take those raw materials, make them into stuff, and sell them around the world at a pretty high profit. So until the French and Indian War, there was really no reason to tax the American colonies. After the war, however, the British government was basically broke. Okay, so they turned to the untapped source of tax revenue, which was the American colonies. However, the American colonies had spent since 1608 with the Jamestown colony governing themselves and being free of most taxes. So this was kind of a hard thing to hit. And the other problem was the British put taxes on everyday commodity, stuff that people had to have, like sugar. Sugar was the main ingredient in rum. Rum was a national drink at the time. The tea tax. Tea is a part of British culture. Heavily taxing it caused a lot of consternation within the colonies. Okay, so the response that the Americans in the colonies always had whenever there was a problem is they tend to form little self-governments, and we formed an organization called the Continental Congress to talk to the British government. Problem was the British government didn't recognize any of this authority. This is not something that would have happened in Britain or anywhere else that the British had colonies around the world. So the American experience in being basically free from British rule for 200 years to now having the British government directly ruling them caused the conflict. Okay, so by the time the 1770s roll around, the colonies are losing patience with the British government. The British government is losing patience with the American colonies. And we see war break out in the 1774 range. Okay. It's just a small war, a war fought between a couple of different colonies, not the entire United States. Okay, by May and June of 1776, however, the colonies were basically in full-blown war with the British, and that Continental Congress tried to debate resolutions to decide whether or not the United States should just become an independent country, so break all ties with Britain. This was done July 2nd, 1776. We formally declared ourselves independent from the British government. 2 days later, the Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Continental Congress. So this document, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, formally announces independence, formally creates the United States, and provides the legal reasoning why we are independent. Contrary to public opinion, the Declaration of Independence was not a document meant to be sent to the King of England. It was meant to be a document describing the reasons why revolution was legal, especially to people in the colonies that didn't want to break off their ties with Britain. You're talking about fighting a long, involved war with the most powerful nation in the world, whose economic livelihood was all spent tied to the British. So where do we get the ideas that eventually form the Constitution and the time period of the 1770s? Well, it's the age of enlightenment around the world. And enlightened philosophy is that you should have a strong understanding and schooling in the sciences, in philosophy, in the arts. Okay, one of these things was political philosophy. So in the late early 1700s, we see a lot of European philosophy centering around the idea of political philosophy. And one of the things that came from it is the idea of John Locke. John Locke heavily influenced our Declaration of Independence. And this is basically his main ideas, that we have natural rights. Okay? They're not dependent on the government. We have them. Okay? And what we do is we give up some of our complete freedom in order to form a government to protect our most essential freedoms. Okay? To John Locke, that's life, liberty, and property. We change it in the Declaration to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but it means the same thing. That means we give up some of our complete freedom. Your freedom to murder, your freedom to steal, to protect us from being murdered and stolen from. Okay, it's an idea known as the social contract that gained popularity, especially in the American colonies, that you have to have consent of the governed in order to have a legitimate government. That means the people have to recognize and give authority to the government to protect your natural rights. Okay, we also looked at limited government, that government shouldn't be involved in every part of our lives. Okay, there should be restrictions, and that's where we get this Constitution. The Constitution is a set of limits placed on the government. You can do these things, but not something else. Okay. So these are some of the documents and contributory thinkers to what eventually becomes the Revolutionary Era and then the Constitution. We go all the way back to 1215 with the Magna Carta, which first is one of the first documents that sets the idea that the king has limited powers. Okay, we understand individual rights through the British Petition of Right and the British Bill of Rights. Okay. Some of the other thinkers is Thomas Hobbes. He writes a pamphlet known as Leviathan that describes this social contract, the idea that we give up complete freedom in order for protection. John Locke becomes the basis for the Declaration of Independence with his idea of consent to the governed, limited government, and natural rights. Okay. And Thomas Paine, this is an American colonist. He writes a pamphlet in 1776 known as Common Sense, and it's his idea that a monarchy can never protect your liberty, that the only way to do it is through a republic, where we elect representatives. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to slide 11 here. Okay, so with the end of the war, we get independence. Okay, but we also get, unfortunately, independence, which means we had to figure out our own governing system. That's going to be known as the Articles of Confederation. Okay. It's not necessarily a government, it's more of a treaty between 13 independent governments. Okay, so if we think of the states at this time like countries, they really were countries. That's why the United States is plural. It means that we're an organization of original 13 separate countries. Okay, and this is a treaty around them to help make trade easier and also to help defend each other. So it really wasn't a government like we would think of. Congress had almost no powers. They couldn't tax. Almost all power rested in the individual states. All the states had their own armies. Most of them had their own navies. They all printed their own currencies or used the British pound as their currency still. So it was a chaotic time. We look at this in the post-war period after the Revolutionary War. We get changes in the states too. Most states began to allow more and more people to vote. So things like removing religious tests, removing property requirements. So we see a bigger middle class that's now able to vote where they wouldn't have been able to vote in their colonies before the war. Okay, so this little chart shows the difference that in the northern states, the pre-war colonial governments were mostly made of wealthy individuals. Okay, after the war, it was mostly made of people of moderate income. The same is true in the southern states, just to a lesser extent.
You see the following students in the main office: Liv LaCrone.
Sorry, I'm on my lunch break and they're making announcements.
Josh Singer, Avery Sloan, Charles Smith, Dane Smith, Delilah Snyder, McKenna Spade, Ethan Stevenson, Merritt Stevens, Nathan Stern, Lauren Stilwell, Charisma Soloff, Keaton Swope, Peyton Bahari, and Braden Whitaker. To the main office.
Alright, so that's all well and good that more people are allowed to vote, and I apologize for those interruptions. I'm at school right now. So the economic turmoil that came in after the war kind of set things up for disaster. So after the Revolutionary War ended, we have states becoming represented by more moderate income, and then we hit a depression, okay, which left a lot of these moderate income people.
Can I have the following students in the attendance office? Keith Dinkins, Matt Smith, Mara Eberhardt, Devin Amy, Brooke Langenbacher, to the attendance office.
Okay, so these are this economic depression left this middle class kind of in a lurch. So now you have representatives that are your friends and neighbors, the middle class. And what we saw was we saw state governments making laws that protected those farmers from, especially foreclosure, from having their creditors take back property that secured their debts, like we would with a mortgage. So Shays' Rebellion was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back with the Articles of Confederation. It showed just how weak it was and how unable the 13 states were to govern themselves in such close proximity to other countries. So Shays' Rebellion was really a silly little thing in the blip of history here. But what it demonstrated was that a small group of people could disrupt an entire economy under the Articles. And that's really what happened, is Daniel Shays and some of his compatriots tried to block foreclosure proceedings. Massachusetts wouldn't put a stop to it, so Virginia actually sent its militia to Massachusetts to put down a revolution in another state. And this scared a lot of people because property rights aren't being protected. A small group of insurrectionists can dislodge the entire democracy. So something had to be done. And that something will become the Constitutional Convention. So, after a first attempt to meet that didn't work, there was an attempt to get a convention held in Philadelphia with the sole purpose of making changes to the Articles, making them stronger. So who are these people? Well, there are 55 men, yes, all men, from 12 of the 13 states. The state of Rhode Island will not participate. Most were wealthy, most were college graduates, and most were from large cities. Very different from the typical American experience. So some of the more famous people that are there, James Madison, he becomes the architect of the Constitution. We have George Washington becomes the president of the Constitutional Convention. Alexander Hamilton, we've all seen the musical probably, becomes a delegate from the state of New York that advocates for a very, very strong national government. Benjamin Franklin is the oldest member there, and there's a few others that you would probably recognize their names, but most of the 55 you'd probably have never heard of. Okay, and their task was originally to revise the Articles of Confederation, but what really happens is we get a new government. Okay, Virginia, headed by James Madison, proposes a plan of government known as the Virginia Plan that requires the Articles of Confederation to basically be absolved and replaced with a new system. Now, they didn't have the authority to do this, they just kind of did it. And this was Madison's philosophy. Okay, we have to deal with human nature. Human nature is self-interested, so how do we make sure that works for the good of a country? Okay. Second problem was we have political conflict. You can see that in 2022, political conflict can be dangerous, it could also be good. Okay, the idea here is how do we control these factional groups, these political parties that might form? Okay, how do we make sure that not one party dominates everything in all 13 states at the time and the national government? Okay, what are the objectives of government? What is this government going to be limited to doing? And that's primarily the preservation of property. And how is this government going to work? Are we going to have a monarchy? Are we going to have a republic? How do we make sure that no one faction rises above and overwhelms the other? So we'll see that eventually in a checks and balance and separate branches of government. Okay. So one of the first issues to resolve in creating a new government is what will this government look like? Okay, the term equality here, I'm using it, this isn't like equality of races, equality of genders, this is equality of participation in the new government. So Virginia wanted it based upon population, that every state would get more members of the new Congress the more people they had in their state. Okay. Virginia argued that this is a government of the people, and the only way to represent the people is to have population-based representation. So Virginia, being the largest state, will get the most representatives. Rhode Island, being the smallest, will get the fewest. Smaller states were weary of this, mostly because they felt that they would be absolutely overwhelmed, that their small populations would be overwhelmed by the larger majority. So they wanted equal representation. They basically wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation where every state, regardless of size, had one vote. The end result will be a compromise. Hard-fought compromise. Will take over a month of debate for them to get there. Where Connecticut proposes that we just do both, which is what we have in modern American government. We have a Congress made up of two houses of government, the House and the Senate. The House is based on population. Okay, the Senate is based on equal numbers per state. Okay, so the result in 2022 is California has the most representatives, but has by having the most people. But has the same number of senators as Montana, which has some of the fewest people in its state. Okay. The other part for equality was about slavery, and this wasn't necessarily a question about the horrors of slavery. This was about, are we going to count slaves? If we're going to have a government based upon how many people live in your state, do we count slaves? Well, the northern states didn't want to because it would have given the South stronger political power. The southern state wanted to count them all because if you're South Carolina, 50% of your population is slave. So the compromise was we would count 3 out of every 5 slaves. The moral question of slavery was brought up at the convention but never gained any traction. In order to pass this document, they didn't touch it. Which is both fortunate and unfortunate. Fortunate is we get this Constitution, which has worked relatively well and relatively stable for 230 years. The negative is it will lead 80 years later to the Civil War, which is still America's bloodiest war over the question of slavery. The rest of equality and who can vote is left to the states and will be until after the Civil War. So this idea of equality that we think of doesn't exist until the 1870s. So the other issues is the other issues are economic problems. So what happened was the Congress got stronger and limited the powers of states over the economy. So the federal government got the power to regulate trade. The federal government got the power to print money, to raise an army, to raise a navy. All of these economic powers went to the national government and were stripped from the states. Most powerful one being the ability to regulate commerce or trade. We'll talk about that next week when we look at federalism, the division of power between the states and the national government. Individual rights, some were in the Constitution, but most of them were left out, which will become a fight after the Constitution was sent to be ratified by the 13 states. So you have the list here of individual rights that are in the Constitution. We have a writ of habeas corpus, which means that you can't be arrested and detained without having evidence of wrongdoing. So the police can't just come and lock you up. That you have to be taken to an arraignment, and they have to show the evidence they have against you, and a judge has to decide whether or not there's enough evidence to hold you. No bill of attainder. That one is pretty well antiquated. It was something Parliament would do in Britain. They would basically pass a law making a person illegal. So you would go to jail without a trial because your existence was actually illegal. Ex post facto means after the fact, which means a law has a starting date, and it can't be you can't be punished for something before it was made illegal. Okay, so the end result in this Constitution is a document that tries to prevent majority rule. One of the weird things is we tout ourselves as a democracy, but the word democracy was a very negative word to the people that wrote the Constitution. They did not want a democracy. They wanted a republic. A republic is where you elect representatives. Those representatives then have the independence to make laws that we follow. A democracy is the idea that everyone votes on everything, and in those situations it could be just as tyrannical as a monarchy or a dictatorship, because we could take away your rights by majority vote. We don't like what you say, we vote to remove you from the island like Survivor. Okay, so Madison's Constitution tries to do these 4 things. It limits the control of the majority. So we have elections. Those elections happen at regular times. Okay, they're chosen by different groups of people. So the president's chosen by the entire country through a state-by-state election, and then approved by an electoral college. Representatives are elected by a small number of people in your state. Like in Pennsylvania, it's about 650,000 people in a congressional district. And the Senate is chosen by your entire state. Okay, the courts, we don't pick at all. The president and the Senate pick and approve the courts. So limit majority control. Okay, the other thing is separating the powers of government. We have 3 separate branches with each having a different responsibility. The executive enforces our laws, so that's the president. The legislative creates our laws, which is the Congress. And the judiciary interprets the meaning of the law, which is the Supreme Court, is what we'll be talking most about. Also, creating checks and balances. It's a system where each branch checks the power of the other, okay, oversees what they do. So, for example, the president can send troops to war, but only Congress can pay for it, and only Congress can declare war. Okay, those are checks and balances. Congress can pass a bill into law, but only if the president signs it, or if they override a veto. Okay. The fourth thing is we establish a federal system. So a hybrid government with where we have a national government in Washington, D.C., but underneath them we have 50 state governments. And those 50 state governments have powers, have all the powers that aren't specifically given to the national government in the Constitution, okay, which is a lot. Like most of you have spent a bulk of your lives so far in public school, maybe. Okay, that's a state power. Our schools look very different in Pennsylvania as they do in other states. Alright, so what we get is a republic. That's the Constitution. It's not a democracy, it's a republic. And it still is that way. It's very undemocratic. Our national government is still very undemocratic. So, for example, we have 4.5 million people that work for the federal government in some capacity, military service, federal employees. We elect 5 of them. The president, the vice president, your 2 senators, and your local representative. So not very many people does the U.S. government elect. And this favors the status quo. Change is very slow. Okay, and that can be frustrating in 2022 where we expect instantaneous everything. Okay, I can order a package from Amazon and I'm angry if it's not there a day or 2 later. Okay. But in a republic, change is meant to be extraordinarily slow and painful. So, what happened is this document was approved at this convention. So 37 of the 55 people signed their name that they approved of the document, but that didn't mean it was the government. It actually had to go to each individual state for them to approve it. It's a process called ratification, the same process we use for amendments to the Constitution. So the real political argument came out after the document was written and people saw what happened in Philadelphia and then had to decide whether or not to make this the new government of the United States. So just like in every other movement in American history, this is fought in the media. Okay, the only media at the time was newspapers. Okay. So if you think of this as the first kind of Twitter battle or Twitter fight, really that's what it was, just a little more sophisticated. Okay, so 2 groups emerge after this, during this ratification period. Federalists were in favor of the Constitution, Anti-Federalists were opposed to the adoption of the Constitution. And they each wrote articles that were published in newspapers. And those articles were meant to convince the citizens of the states to either adopt the Constitution or vote against it. Okay, so the more famous is the Federalist Papers. Why? Well, history is written by the victors. So we look at the Federalist Papers more frequently. But it's also important because this is an explanation of the Constitution from 3 of the main people that helped draft it. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Anti-Federalists were just as famous. Patrick Henry was one. Thomas Jefferson was one. Okay. So in the end, by 1791, all 13 states adopt the U.S. Constitution. But what forced their hand was the Anti-Federalists insisted that a Bill of Rights be added, a list of rights that the federal government can't take from you as an individual. that was the biggest contribution anti-federalists got for this country, was that they got us the rights to free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom to be secure from illegal searches and seizures, okay, written into the Constitution. All right, so one of the ways to change this document is to formally ratify it, or excuse me, formally amend it. A formal amendment is spelled out inside the Constitution. Okay, so you can look at the document and it tells us how it does it. Basically, there's two phases to any amendment. First phase is it has to be proposed, and that has to happen at the national level. So either through Congress doing it, which is the way that all amendments have been proposed so far, all 27 of them. The other way is we could have a national convention, like what happened in Philadelphia in 1787. We don't know what that would look like. There's no real explanation. Legal scholars are in heavy debate about what that would look like. And it's kind of scarily, this has been proposed by almost 2/3 of the states, that we hold some sort of national convention to amend the Constitution. The second part of it is ratification, which means approval. So first phase has to come from the country as a whole, and that's the proposal. The second phase is adopting the amendment or approving the amendment. That has to happen on a state-by-state basis. Okay, so it's really the key takeaway here is that amendments are complex, they're hard to do, which is the idea behind the discussion board this week. But are they too hard to do? They are certainly harder in the modern America than what was anticipated by the people that wrote this document. Okay, so because we can't amend the Constitution, or it's nearly politically impossible to do so, we do it through informal means. Okay, so the informal process is through judicial interpretation, court cases. And the article that you're going to read for the discussion board talks heavily about that the ability of the Supreme Court to look and interpret the Constitution, tell us what it means, has impacted our country greatly. We have changing political practice. The Constitution was written before political parties exist, and now we have political parties, and that changes how everything in our government works. We have congressional committees. They aren't listed in the Constitution, but they're based on what political party controls Congress. Technology has changed. When the words Commander-in-Chief were written, the most powerful weapon George Washington had at his disposal was a cannon. Today, President Biden has enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world multiple times. And think of that as we're debating whether or not we should intervene militarily in Ukraine with Russia, a big subject in the news this week. And we also have more demands on policymakers. We expect our government to do far more than what was ever anticipated in 1787. Okay, we're in the midst of year 3 of a pandemic. We are now expecting government to provide us with masks, with at-home tests, more so than what would have ever been thought of in 1787. So we expect our government to do far more than what it was initially created to do. Okay, so one of the things is the Constitution is flexible, which is why it's been such a successfully stable document. Okay, it's short, only 8,000 words. You can read it in probably 20 minutes, but it doesn't prescribe every detail, which means we can adapt it, but sometimes those adaptations cause other problems. Alright, so for your assignment this week, you have their discussion board, so again, you're supposed to post an answer to the discussion board on constitutional amendments and reply to 2 of your classmates. We're trying to generate an academic discussion on this topic between you. So you might agree, you might disagree. That's fine, but we want you guys to talk with one another as much as you can in an online forum. The other assignment, which is your weekly assignment, which will be due next Monday, on the 31st, is to read one of the Federalist papers, specifically Federalist number 10. This is James Madison's argument why the Constitution protects us from political parties, or what he calls factions, more than the Articles of Confederation did, okay, and more than a democracy ever could. Okay, so why is the Constitution more stable in protecting us from these factions than the Articles of Confederation? Alright, well, I'll let you go. If you have any questions on any of the material, please feel free to email me. I put my cell phone number on the syllabus so you can call or text if you get into a bind. But let me know before problems come up. Alright, have a great week. If you need anything, give me a shout.